Everybody. I'm just going to move to the next slide here. I'm Sean Nestor. Thank you for that introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys today about rights of nature. There's a lot I could say. I have done the about section is always tricky because I've actually been involved with probably a few dozen different issue campaigns and causes and organizations, pretty much all based in Toledo, Ohio, though. I've kept it very local because I feel like that's where I can make the most impact. I think many of you probably are experienced in trying to promote social change, and you know the challenges and the obstacles that come when you go on the state and federal level. It's a big lift, and I've always found that locally you can really get in, get some great experience. And the hope for me has always been to try to get meaningful work done locally that can be used to build the infrastructure and the experience necessary to move things on the bigger levels. So hopefully you guys today are going to be looking at this stuff and maybe getting some ideas and talking about what you can do to work on policies for change that hopefully can include rights of nature. And I hope we get to cover some good ground and ask some good questions in the process. But this slide, I kept it pretty simple. I'm going to keep it kind of limited to my work specifically on water issues here in Toledo, Ohio. And I was essentially the campaign manager for the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. We were a very egalitarian kind of, as they say, horizontal organization. So there wasn't a lot of strict hierarchy. We shared a lot of roles. I don't want to give the impression that I was the only one who was out there doing things. There were several very talented people who put a lot of work into this, including Marky Miller, Crystal Jankowski, Hillary Torrey, John Michael Durbeck, Ariel Gruba, Cindy Matthews, Adrian Matthews, Hagdu. The list goes on. It's almost like you hesitate to start naming them because if you do that, you're like, I'm going to leave somebody out and I don't want anybody to feel left out. But we did a great deal of work on this as a team. And I'll talk more about that a little bit. But when I was doing the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, I've been kind of on a string of citizens initiatives, which is something of a specialty of mine. The process of collecting signatures in order to place an issue on the ballot. I know we have people from all over on this call today. So, many people may not have the ability, depending on where you're at, to circulate petitions to enact a local law. You may not even have the ability to circulate petitions to enact a state law, although I think that's more common. But that was the tool that I started to use a lot at that time. And I've worked on 4 initiative campaigns, all of which passed with what they would say is a landslide margin of victory, including the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. So I'll talk a little bit more about that process. And I'm glad to answer questions or engage in conversations about that in particular. But I find it to be an underutilized tool for really getting bold ideas out there and meaningful changes enacted. So just keep that in the back of your mind that the Lake Erie Bill of Rights made its way there, not through lobbying and convincing legislators, because that's always a tough lift, right? Especially for something really bold and ambitious, but through a citizens initiative where we took this right to the voters. So I've been around and I've been working on politics and activism since about 2010, 2011. So going on about 14, 15 years now. I'm 39. I have a day job in IT that has nothing to do with activism. Nobody would pay me to do this kind of work. It's all a labor of love, but it's something that I'm really proud of, and I'm always eager for an opportunity to talk about it. So again, I'm grateful for being here today. And with that, I'm going to just kind of go right in and start talking about rights of nature. I'm going to start with like just a high level overview of what it is. And again, if you're just joining us too, I know you're probably going to have some questions, but a reminder, if you could keep your microphone on mute, just in case the postman comes or the dog barks or something, we don't have as many disruptions. And you can put your questions at any time in the chat, and I'll try to go through and address them at the end because I may end up covering it somewhere in my slides here. So let's go into it and talk about rights of nature. And let's start by laying out the concept. I think the name itself is evocative and kind of illustrates what we're talking about. The basic fundamental idea is that we want to put into our legal system that nature, however you may view that, the natural systems that we often treat as objects under our legal system should be given rights, like actual rights, the way that we're often thinking about in terms of human rights or the Bill of Rights. We're saying that we need to look at nature as having rights, not just an object to be objectified and regulated and piecemeal addressed. And there's a lot of different approaches to this. There's not one necessarily uniform idea. And obviously, this is a really interesting concept from the get-go. So your mind is probably already racing with, well, what does that mean? And how can that be applied? We'll touch on some of that here in some of the coming slides. But the idea is that we want to be able to take our legal system, which is largely based on English common law, and under English common law and the variations of modern court systems and legal systems that have arisen from that, you generally can kind of categorize things in one of two areas. You're a living being with rights or your property. And if you're property, there's a way of looking at you under the legal system. And if you're a person with rights, there's a different way of looking at you in the legal system. And the idea is we want to move nature into that category, right? And the reason we do that is because taking advantage of pre-existing grooves that have been kind of wound into the legal system gives us a lot more avenues to address the ways that nature is being harmed. And the argument behind rights of nature is that the regulatory system, while beneficial and while it may be able to address things, also has some downsides, and it also has some challenges itself, and that there may be an advantage to taking a different approach and applying rights to nature rather than strictly regulating it as an object under the kind of ward of the state model. So the question you have to ask yourself is, does the existing legal framework really do enough to protect the environment that we all depend on for survival? And we have to take a moment and remember that's really what it is. That's not an embellishment. That's not an exaggeration. That's not a rhetorical argument. We depend on the environment, and the environment depends on us. We are integrated into this system. We are not as separate from it as we often think individually and culturally. We absolutely depend on the natural world for our survival. And that alone should get us thinking that maybe it needs to be given a little bit of a stronger standing in our legal system than what it currently enjoys. And obviously, when you start talking about rights of nature, this is such a different paradigm to look at the environment and the law through. No matter where you're coming from politically, it's probably something you have to wrestle with and chew on for a little bit. And I will say that if it helps, there are some legal basis for this. So before I go too much further, let me clarify. I am not a lawyer. But this information is largely pulled from attorneys and lawyers, people versed in law. This is because I've participated in education programs put on by organizations like the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. A lot of the basis, and if it sounds like I'm talking like I'm a legal expert, it's not because I'm a legal expert, but I do understand enough about law. I've taken courses in law in college at the master's level. I have taken, in fact, environmental law in particular. I have some baseline knowledge. I'm not just making things up. And while I'm not an expert, I still know enough to, feel comfortable talking about this. But, if you are an attorney on this call and you want to, get really in the weeds, I'm not the right guy. However, I can put you in touch with the right person to have that debate and to ask those questions too. Still, let's talk about the legal basis. And actually, one of the most interesting things from a legal basis for rights of nature comes from a court case called Sierra Club v. Morton in 1971, when Justice Douglas actually made a dissenting opinion saying the conferral of standing upon environmental objects to sue for their own preservation. He was talking about that, and that those who have that intimate relation with the inanimate object about to be injured, polluted, or otherwise despoiled are its legitimate spokesmen. So even though this is a dissenting opinion, it's still a valid legal opinion from a Supreme Court justice. And, these are legal thoughts that do carry merit. And I think help us to understand that it's not beyond the pale. It's not impossible that a legal system could be developed, or that our legal system that we use today could be developed and adjusted to take these things into account. So standing, if you're not familiar with the term, is basically who has the right to even file in court and present in court. It's one of the most basic things when there's a court case is that somebody has to have standing. They have to have the legal right to actually say, I have a grievance that needs to be addressed that a court case is going to be the avenue for. So establishing standing, if you've been involved with these fights, is sometimes one of the biggest obstacles. Who can file the lawsuit? Who has the standing? Who has the legal, right to go into court and say this is an issue that needs to be addressed and that we need to expend court resources on the issue. Standing is one of the biggest obstacles in environmental matters, and if you're experienced with the regulatory model, that can be a tricky thing to figure out depending on what the harm being done is. So just a year after that case, Sierra Club v. Morton, there was a very interesting article that has kind of become famous in legal circles and even outside of that. And it was published in the Southern California Law Review, and it was an article by Christopher Stone, and it was called "Should Trees Have Standing? Toward Legal Rights for Natural Objects." And this was where individuals really started to talk about and think and pontificate on the possibility that our legal system could be adapted to give standing to what we currently consider to be strictly objects to be meted out and to be deliberated upon as though we would any sort of this pen or a notepad or a house. Really, the unspoiled natural beauty of the world under our legal system is not distinguished from these objects. But should we do that? And giving standing and starting to recognize standing is one of the first major obstacles there. There's also an interesting court case in Cetacean Community v. Bush in 2004. This court case overall is just really fascinating in general because, as you could tell by the name, it was the community of cetaceans who live, which meaning animals, that were actually suing the Bush administration for certain policies enacted by the federal government that was likely to harm them. And basically, the finding of that court case, and this was a circuit court, so this wasn't the Supreme Court, but it's still up there, said that non-human animals don't have legal rights. However, if a legislative body like Congress or like a state legislative body, a General Assembly or a state legislature, if legislators say it, they would be given legal rights. So there are some legal arguments here established through case law and through court decisions that actually say if people legislate it, it's absolutely possible that we could be granting rights to living creatures or to animals or to natural entities. And that opens up a lot of questions, as it should. There was also a Rights of Nature symposium that went on for a couple of days at Tulane Law School, a very prestigious law school down in New Orleans. I was there for it. I attended it. And during that symposium, scholars, legal experts, and others who were drawn to the issue of rights of nature all came together to hold panel discussions and to debate these ins and outs. Because it's not, again, this concept is not, we know every answer, we know every possibility. And if that's a turnoff to you, I just want to remind you that that's actually the case for a lot of good laws. I'm going to make this point again. You'll probably hear me say it at least one more time before the end of this presentation. But, if the vagueness of this or if the, what does that mean bothers you, think about things like the First Amendment and the concept of freedom of speech. That's a very vague statement. Count how many words are in the First Amendment. Do we consider the First Amendment a bad law? Generally, it's one of the most cherished things that we hold up in esteem in our country is the First Amendment to the Constitution. And that's a vague law with a lot of room for interpretation. And what does that mean? We still, to this day, a couple hundred years on, are debating what that means and what the parameters are. Why should rights of nature be any different? Don't be afraid to assert that this should be established. Saying we can't do this until we have every single possible answer and every single possible pitfall figured out. That's never been how law really gets done in this country. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. So anyways, this is a high level of what we're talking about when we say rights of nature. It's an idea, it's a legal concept that nature is given rights under the law and is no longer treated strictly as property under the legal system. So with that in mind, I want to just, I'm going to not spend a lot of time on this, but this is a global movement that is happening in more modern times. As you saw, there are court cases and legal opinions going back to the early 70s. However, it's really in the last 10, 15 years or so that we've started to see this grow, not just here in the United States, but elsewhere. Probably the biggest example is that the country of Ecuador enshrined rights of nature into its constitution in 2008. And if you're one of the people who's really curious or skeptical about rights of nature on the basis of how can this possibly work, go look at what's being trialed essentially in Ecuador with their rights of nature and how it's been applied. So, it's functioned for them. It's been able to be used. It's been debated. There's essentially case law being developed there about, reasonable parameters, practical ways to do this, and how it differs from the regulatory model. That's all being done in Ecuador. Yes, Ecuador has a different legal system, and their case law is not our case law. However, if again, on a broader legal and philosophical perspective, there's a lot to be learned there. And we're starting to see situations like in New Zealand, where the Wangani River was granted legal status in 2017. India took the Ganga and Yamuna rivers and gave them legality and personhood, essentially, granting them rights under the law also in 2017. And so it's really not limited to one continent. This is something that's being discussed. I don't have it on here, but I believe the Chinese government has also at least explored, if not enacted, certain protections for rivers. One thing you're going to see, just focusing on the overseas for a moment, is there's a lot of emphasis on bodies of water. Rights of nature is not exclusive to bodies of water. It can be applied to anything. However, we have seen probably the most urgent application of it to be bodies of water, not just here domestically, but all over the world. And take from that what you may. Focusing a little bit on the United States for a bit, Grant Township, which is a very small township in Pennsylvania, altered its charter in 2014 for what was called a Community Bill of Rights. And that broadly recognized rights of nature in their local legal system and was used primarily by the citizens of that township to object to an injection well being built for fracking and purposes. So they enacted that in 2014 and immediately got, embroiled in legal battles over what this means and, whether it can be enforced or not. So that occurred in 2014 and immediately kickstarted conflicts between the residents of Grant Township, the government of Grant Township, the courts, the frackers who wanted to come into their community. Now, part of why they were objecting to fracking was they were concerned about the quality of the watershed and the water they had access to. So, there's still that connection, but the Community Bill of Rights that they enacted was not exclusive to water. It was a broader embracing of the concept enshrined in their local law. So what we did, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, was enacted in Toledo, Ohio in 2019. We're going to spend some slides exploring that. I'm going to give you the story of that here soon. But that was a big deal. That was, and again, we'll get into all that. And that was kind of the first time a major city enacted this, especially for an entity like Lake Erie. And that was specific to granting Lake Erie rights. That's what we did. We didn't do a broad, all nature has rights. We said Lake Erie has rights under our city charter. The year after, kind of, I think, inspired by that, Orange County, Florida, also enacted a right to clean water charter amendment in a similar vein. And that was a much larger community. Toledo, Ohio's, depending on whether you want to go for the city proper or the metro area, you're either talking about 280,000 or about 450 to 500,000 people, whereas Orange County was more like 700 to 750,000 people impacted. So these are large areas of people that are voting into law that they want to see nature given rights. So also in 2020, a court decision finally came down after about 7 years saying, yeah, Grant Township's rights of nature law is going to be used to reject this injection well permit. So the court system ultimately said they have a right to reject that permit and their law is applicable. There's also a documentary with Mark Ruffalo, famous actor, some of you may have heard of, It's called Invisible Hand, and it's all about, it's not Invisible Hands, plural, which is a different documentary about a different issue, but Invisible Hand was a documentary released in 2020 specifically focused on rights of nature and profiling both Grant Township and Toledo, Ohio, and the fight there. So some of our team members are interviewed with that. It's a great documentary. I encourage you guys to check it out if this is something of interest to you. But this is just a little bit of some of the history. You notice a lot of these years are recent years. So, these are things that are new and still developing. And if you decide this is something you're interested in a way, you're kind of getting in on the ground floor because this is such a growing movement still, not just here in the United States, but elsewhere. So let's talk about Toledo, Ohio, and the Lake Erie Bill of Rights specifically. And I'll keep this as brief as I can, but in 2014, I believe it was August 1st of 2014, all of us here in Toledo, Ohio, and the surrounding area were issued an official do not drink advisory. And it wasn't just do not drink, it was do not shower, do not use this for anything. Because what had happened is the harmful algal blooms that had been kind of a regular feature of Lake Erie, the western basin of Lake Erie near where Toledo, Ohio is, as well as, the Maumee River and all the tributaries to it, harmful algal blooms had been growing. Some of us who were environmentalists knew and paid attention, but most people in the public really didn't take notice until they got a do not drink advisory from the government that lasted 2.5 days. Now, that was because the water treatment system detected levels of microcystin, which is a toxin, as you know, in the water supply, and decided, as a matter of public safety, that they were going to just turn this off and say, do not use this water. You still had access to it, but again, people weren't supposed to be using it. People did. There were reports of people getting sick and going to the hospital. And so that act really woke up everybody in the Toledo area. And I will say to this day, people here in Toledo and the suburbs and the surrounding areas that depend on Toledo's water treatment facility are still very interested in the issue of water safety, the health of our water, and harmful algal blooms in general. It's still something the local media covers. It's still something politicians bring up when they run for office. It became an issue because people still remember almost 10 years ago that they lost water for 2.5 days. And of course, all the things that you would imagine happened. All of the grocery stores in the Toledo area got completely wiped out of bottled water. In fact, every grocery store within about 50 miles of Toledo got wiped out. So every dollar store, every grocery store, every corner store was completely wiped out. It raised the attention of the state and federal government because you essentially have an emergency situation. And that water, the do not drink advisory lasting for 2.5 days, there were a lot of people anxious because they weren't certain when they'd be able to drink water again. In hindsight, we could say it was only 2.5 days, so long weekend. But a lot of people at the time didn't know if it was going to be weeks or months. For all we knew, this was a permanent situation. So this really became a political issue immediately and became something that everybody here was talking about. So I helped form a group called Toledoans for Safe Water. You could see our logo there in the top right. Very pretty logo. It's with the Toledo skyline. And we actually formed this in collaboration with an organizer out of Cincinnati named Allison Alciello, who worked for Food and Water Watch. She reached out to me and had some resources, and we kind of collaborated. We formed a group, and we did an event in the 1-year anniversary of the water crisis. So in 2015, you can see that picture there, that beautiful picture of us. We built a geodesic dome made out of over 6,000 plastic water bottles that were collected from Toledoans in the aftermath of the water crisis. I put out calls. I collected trash bags full of these. And an artist from Philadelphia named Deidre Krieger got put in touch with me. She put out a call and said she wanted to come to Toledo and do this art installation that she knew how to do because she's an artist and does this all around the country to raise awareness of plastic bottle waste and water issues. And so she wanted to do one in Toledo. We had a mutual friend. We got connected. She came here with the team and helped supervise the installation. And there are, you see it getting built in that photo, but right there on shoreline of the Maumee River, one of the major tributaries to the western basin of Lake Erie. We built this really cool geodesic dome that you can go inside of. And beyond that art installation, we had a panel discussion with experts discussing what had happened in the previous year. We also had individuals talk about the experience they went through, local business owners that were struggling to operate and were put in economically precarious positions because water was not available. I mean, imagine trying to run a restaurant without water that's safe to use. I mean, you could just, the mind reels. And so we did this event a year on, and we got some media coverage. You can see it there, a little screenshot. But there was really just a public awareness event. It really wasn't advocating for policy change. It was just something we did to kind of remind people and keep the issue alive. And we were one of many people doing that. So what ended up happening there is we got put in touch with a national organization that you'll see here a lot, CELDEF, CELDF, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. I refer to them as CELDEF. And they were kind of affiliated. Several people more locally who were involved with CELDEF had a organization on the state level called the Ohio Community Rights Network, which is that OHCRN that you see. So the Ohio Community Rights Network was made up of several people from smaller municipalities and larger ones too, all over Ohio, who were interested in rights of nature and community rights in general. So over in Youngstown, there were a lot of people very interested in the fracking issue who kept fighting and fighting to get a community Bill of Rights enacted locally, like Grand Township in Pennsylvania had. And we had people in Columbus doing the same. Bowling Green, Ohio, just a half hour south of here, also had people working to try to establish a community Bill of Rights. However, those were not able to be successful. Youngstown went to the ballot 7, 8 times, and every time industry, the oil and gas industry, just dumped a ton of money into these fear-mongering campaigns, mailers that went out, and they would, just narrowly lose every time, but they kept going back and fighting and fighting and fighting. So a lot of those folks were networking, collaborating, and we weren't necessarily a part of that, but we, there were resources, there were veterans of these fights who were involved. And CELDEF, which is a national organization and doesn't necessarily do the petitioning or anything, but they had legal resources, and they also helped kind of frame the argument. They've been the biggest advocates and the champions for rights of nature since their founding in 1996. So they really developed the idea in the United States and really were the torchbearers for it. And in, I want to say 2016, early 2016 maybe, Thomas Lindsay, a prominent figure and a founder of CELDEF, came and spoke at Bowling Green State University. I was there to witness it, and he gave a great presentation. Afterwards, some of us went out to the bar to drink with him and have some food. And he kind of said, are you guys are from Toledo? Is there anything, what are the environmental issues in Toledo? I said, water. Harmful algal blooms are, something that everybody is talking about. Every politician is talking about what they're going to do about it. The people of Toledo are always wanting to know what's going on and what's being done. And, there was still a lot of finger pointing about where this was coming from. But a lot of us kind of knew at that point, and anybody who was paying attention knew that the proliferation of CAFOs, concentrated animal feed operations or factory farms, were really the biggest driving factor because they have unregulated waste disposal. They just have these cesspools of untreated animal waste from millions and millions of animals, no exaggeration, that has no treatment. And these are animals that are treated with antibiotics and other chemicals. So their waste is, it's not like it's all organic stuff. That's seeping into the watershed. The watershed is then taking those chemicals, it's feeding the growth of these harmful algal blooms. And prior to the proliferation of these CAFOs, we didn't see these algal blooms. So, all over Northwest Ohio, where these more rural parts for the most part, where these CAFOs existed, it's like, how do you hold them accountable? Especially because they have very strong lobbying through the Ohio Farm Bureau, which is also deeply tied to the oil and gas industry. So it started to come out and more people started to know where the issue was stemming from, but people were saying, well, what are we doing about it? Is what can be done legally, politically, anything? So we said through that conversation that took place, we started to piece together the idea for a Lake Erie Bill of Rights. The name Lake Erie Bill of Rights came out at that Irish bar, the Stone's Throw in Bowling Green, Ohio, in early 2016. So we started having some conversations back and forth. I'm not going to go into gritty detail, but some of us local activists started putting together a team of people that were interested in carrying this forward. We built our own team and built up Toledoans for Safe Water as the team that would do this. And we collaborated by email to develop the legal language with CELDF, which had attorneys and had experience with rights of nature. So we kind of went back and forth and helped shape the actual language for this, which, I think there's some examples elsewhere in this presentation for it. But the big thing is that the big assertion of the Lake Erie Bill of Rights is that it recognizes the rights of Lake Erie, including the right to exist, flourish, and evolve in a more natural state. So that was actually legally enshrined. The city of Toledo, in our own charter, our little local constitution, asserts that Lake Erie has the right to exist, to flourish, and to evolve in a more natural state. And again, the mind races. What does that mean? Well, what does the First Amendment mean? Again, I'll go back to that. So we were the first rights of nature legislation for a body of water in the United States. We made that history. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a slide or two, some of the things that came out from this, but let's talk about a little bit more. There's kind of a timeline here, and I'm not going to go over every aspect, but basically in August of 2018, we turned in 10,528 signatures, 6,438 were deemed valid, and that was enough per the law in Ohio. The local board of elections, under pressure from the building trades who were working for oil and gas companies, used this like little known Ohio law that was there at the time that was kind of giving every county board of elections the ability to arbitrarily decide what would be put to voters and what wasn't. So there was this state law that basically said, hey, a board of elections, if you just feel like it might not be legal, just go ahead and keep it off the ballot, which is really not. Judicial review in the legal system is something that's actually very important. Granting that to non-lawyers, who most boards of elections, the people on it are not lawyers, giving non-lawyers the ability to do that was a big deal and ended up being the subject of court cases that went in front of the Ohio Supreme Court. There's a couple things in the middle there that I'm just going to try to give context to without going down too big a rabbit hole. But another citizens initiative I got involved with at the same time, called Keep the Jail Downtown, did another charter amendment asserting that any new jail or prison built had to be built in our downtown overlay district, because at the time our county government was trying to build it in people's neighborhoods. And a lot of people stepped up to circulate petitions, and they kind of were parallel. They both went to the Board of Elections at the same time, and the Board of Elections rejected them both. So we both had to go in front of the Ohio Supreme Court with the exact same issue at the exact same time. Interestingly, the Ohio Supreme Court kind of turned down the Lake Erie Bill of Rights from being able to have any real recourse. But for Keep the Jail Downtown, they did give them some recourse and said, hey, we agree that this state law that's being incited is not legal. Boards of elections really can't have judicial review powers. However, for this particular case, your city government has to pass an ordinance saying it's okay to put these on the ballot, which they then did, under some pressure. And so we had a special election for both of these issues in February 26th of 2019. And the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, about 2 weeks before it was to be voted on, everybody in Toledo got peppered with these political mailers claiming that the group Toledoans for Safe Water was entirely from out-of-town special interests, that we were going to destroy the economy and ruin jobs and just desolate Toledo if this passes. And it turned out this was entirely being funded by British Petroleum out of Texas. Talk about out-of-town agitators. A large corporation based in another state came in and dumped $300,000, it turned out, overall, on television ads, radio ads, mailers. They were social media ads. They actually had two different kind of groups that they just invented. I think one was called the Toledo Jobs and Growth Coalition. Again, they just made this name up. That group never existed. It had a PO box at a FedEx office, and it was just a political consultant that they hired to do this stuff. And they ran these smear ads. We started, and we were a small grassroots operation. So we had $300,000 opposing us, and we had $6,000 to spend. We did like a very small mailer for what we could afford, and we did, that was the entire campaign. We raised $6,000. Again, we were scrappy and grassroots. But despite being outraised 50-1, we still managed to win with 61.15% of the people of Toledo voting in favor of it. Because again, this issue is so visceral. A lot of people, some people probably believe the propaganda, but so many people, I think, saw through it and just said, we're literally talking about protecting our water, which is so essential, and we're not seeing really meaningful action. And again, over 60% of people voted to approve Lake Erie Bill of Rights, which was exciting. And through this whole process, we gained national, actually international attention. We were covered by major newspapers all over the world, including Le Monde in France. The New York Times did a piece, Smithsonian Magazine. We had several major outlets covering this concept. Jeopardy, we were questioned on Jeopardy. I forget the exact phrasing, but it was to the effect of, this major city enacted a law to, give Lake Erie rights. So that was pretty cool. One of our lead individuals, Marky Miller, was invited by the United Nations to speak on Earth Day in front of the United Nations, which she did. So this was a tremendous, there was a real buzz. This was a really fascinating concept to people. And in the pictures that you see here, you can see we printed a list of several of these entities that came together to formally oppose this. And you can see it's all the big agriculture entities and a couple, the Ohio Oil and Gas Association, the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, the American Petroleum Institute. And it's pretty intimidating. A lot of us were scared because we had big money and big corporations against us, but we won. I think that's one of the really crazy and wonderful things about it is, I felt pretty confident just because I knew the issue and I knew the people of Toledo and I knew what this meant. And we actually beat all those entities, being a small grassroots operation of about a dozen to a dozen and a half of us core volunteers, and then a few dozen more other people volunteering. We didn't pay our petitioners, all of this was just volunteer work, and we managed to make it work. It was a real David and Goliath situation. So, okay, it passes in February 26th of 2019. What then, right? So literally the next morning, before the law legally was put into effect, because once a law is formally approved, it has to wait so many days before it's there. February 27th, this entity called Dravis Farms is how that's pronounced, that nobody had ever heard of, and it turned out later didn't actually exist. There's actually no Dravis Farms. It turned out this was another kind of paper entity created with funding from the oil and gas industry, but it was presented to the public as a small farm that was just going to be hurt by all this stuff and needed to, sue to prevent this from happening. So that went to a state court, and we kind of knew this was going to happen. The state court took advantage of state preemption to say your local government does not have the right to pass this law. So, to enforce this law, because the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, if you look at our local charter, that is still, the language is still there, and it has not been repealed. It cannot be repealed. But as far as the enforcement, it's not able to be enforced currently because the state government came in and said it's not. And that we kind of knew that was going to happen. And we'll talk more about, if you knew that was going to happen, why would you do this? There's a slide I have in a little bit about strategy and talk about that. But of course, on the issue of the harmful algal blooms and what's going on, okay, so the Lake Erie Bill of Rights comes and gets passed. What's going on with that? We still have harmful algal blooms. The local government, the city of Toledo, and the regional water commission that they established for all the suburban governments that get water from us, Now, they just counter. We spend a few $1 million more a year to add more chlorine and other chemicals to counter the microcystin. So, we're all of us here in Toledo are basically cleaning up the mess from all these unregulated CAFOs who have very strong lobbyists that have essentially paid off our state government. And another grassroots group that we worked with that was originally called Advocates for a Clean Lake Erie. They changed their name a few years ago to Lake Erie Advocates. We worked closely with them, and many of their participants petitioned for us and were supporters of the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. They've also pursued more conventional models of lobbying. So it's interesting to look at where that's gone. With the help of a law firm out of Chicago, the Environmental Law and Policy Center, ELPC, Lake Erie Advocates and the Lucas County government here and the ELPC all filed suit a few years ago against the Ohio and the US EPA, saying you are not doing enough to protect the water under the Clean Water Act. And that was successful. And what that led to is the Ohio EPA and the US EPA approving what's called, TMDL for, well, number one, they did finally declare the Western Basin of Lake Erie impaired. So under Clean Water Act, an impaired watershed designation opens up the doors for other actions, which could include a total maximum daily load or TMDL. You could, start to put some limits and regulation on what can be put into it. But of course, we always knew that it gets tricky to do this because there's point sources and non-point sources. All of these CAFOs technically are non-point sources, which are very difficult to regulate because under, again, the legal construct, it's like it has no idea how to treat these entities. They're non-point. There's not an obvious way to say this is a pollution point that's leading to pollution over here. Even though science knows that and human beings know that, our legal system is not able to catch up. And that's based on the Clean Water Act and how that's applied. Well, anyways, this lawsuit went through and it was successful in that our EPAs finally stepped up and said, okay, impaired watershed and there's going to be a TMDL. However, that TMDL is explicitly weak and is still asking for voluntary compliance with no real enforcement. So actually just last week, our city government and our Lucas County government filed a new lawsuit against the EPA saying they are still not enforcing the Clean Water Act. And we're going to have to wait a few years and see what that yields. But one thing is that we're still almost 10 years on from the water crisis. And while we have treated the water, we've counterbalanced it. There are still harmful algal blooms that are affecting the ecosystem of Lake Erie. The harm is still being done. Nothing really has been done to mitigate the impact of excess phosphorus from animal waste and these unregulated CAFOs, leading to pollution of the watershed, leading to the harmful algal blooms, leading to toxins being in the water. And yes, we can treat them before they get to the water supply, but there's still a lot of damage that's occurring. And we could actually not have to do as much. We could reduce the amount of money for all those chemicals and save taxpayers here in Toledo a lot of money if we only could get the lake cleaned up the way it should be. So other things that occurred beyond the specifics of what occurred here in Toledo with Lake Erie are that other communities started to copy what we were doing. So probably the biggest one is, in Orange County, Florida. They put a right to clean water charter amendment in front of voters, and it passed with 89% of people in favor. That's a pretty overwhelming number. In fact, you rarely see anything pass with that high of a value. And just last year, they ran into a similar issue. They enacted a local law. The state government came in, preempted it, and said, we're not going to allow you to enforce this. So as of last year, those organizers have mounted up and they are now collecting signatures for a statewide rights of nature amendment that would give a statewide right to clean water. So they're escalating. They're going to the next level. And here in Ohio, in Cincinnati, just last year, a group called Citizens for Rights to the Ohio River Watershed, or CROW, said that they're going to do an Ohio River Bill of Rights, and they're going to look at what they're going to do what Lake Erie Bill of Rights did. And again, we knew both of these things would happen when we set out to do this. We knew this before the vote took place. We were prepared by CELDF, and we were prepared ourselves to deal with this. We knew that the courts were going to fight us. This wasn't just going to be we passed a law and now it's going to be the law of the land. We knew there was going to be obstacles. We also knew, though, that this is essentially a form of legislative civil disobedience that's going to inspire and motivate other people to start doing the same. And I think that's proven to be true, not just here in Ohio, but in Florida. And there's other communities having conversations about this as well that aren't covered in this slide. So that's kind of what occurred as an outcome. And that's what's going to lead me to my last real slide here, which is just to talk about the strategy of rights of nature. What does this mean? I don't know enough about the individuals present here in this conversation today. I don't know where the listener of this presentation is coming from, but I will say that most environmentalists are really experts at looking at the regulatory model that we have today and the methods we have for trying to protect the environment today, which largely depend on, say, an EPA or a Department of Natural Resources, or one of these regulatory bodies that the federal government and some state governments have set up in order to protect the environment. Now, all of that still, nature is still an object, but it's an object that the state is sort of, giving some special treatment for. However, I think many people, and especially if you've really done the work, you know that regulatory capture is a real issue. The person who headed the EPA in Ohio for a long time during all of this was somebody who was previously a lobbyist for the Ohio Farm Bureau. Those are the kind of people that our state government generally tends to appoint to have these regulatory agencies, are people from the very industries that they are meant to regulate. And it's not hard to see that most of the time they're not going to leverage the full force of what they're capable of to go after that industry, because they literally come from that industry. And if you talk to a lot of lay workers, I've spoken to several people who work for the EPA or for the Department of Natural Resources. The day-to-day people who help run these administrations are constantly frustrated because many of them were environmental science majors in college. They went out and did they are personally motivated to protect the environment, but what they ended up doing and finding their job was approving permits to damage the environment. That's most of what your agencies do. Did you pay the right fee? Did you jump through these hoops? Did you fill out the right paperwork? Well, if you did, go ahead. We're giving you a permit to do it. And somewhere politically, somewhere on top, there's likely an exchange of money going on to make sure that if people do get riled up about the environment being damaged and why isn't this regulatory body doing more, that it doesn't go very far. That capture is very real. So our approach, and I am not employed by CELDF. I've never been employed by CELDF. However, I did work with CELDF, and a lot of this is informed by CELDF strategy, which I agree with, is that we have to use grassroots democracy to grow the rights of nature movement. It's not the only tool. Lobbying is obviously another major part of that, and that has its place. And what we write about and what we journal about and what we put in the media and the conversations we have, there's a lot of different steps we have to make for any big change. But probably the biggest thing we need to do is really put this issue out front and talk about it and assert it in our legal system. So we take CELDF does these things called democracy schools, where they have like a whole curriculum and a book, and you spend a better part of a day or a weekend going through and learning about interesting parts of American history or state history in your given state, to learn about the way government has changed and what has been responsible for those big changes. So the folks at CELDF take a lot of inspiration from the abolitionists in this country who fought to get rid of slavery, and the suffragists who later fought to reestablish the women's right to vote. Because, little known fact that you learn in democracy school, prior to the US Constitution, when we had the Articles of Confederation, several states and territories actually did give women the right to vote. But in 1787, when we established the US Constitution, women were not given the right to vote. So that was a blanket thing, and they actually lost it. And much like arguments today, it wasn't just, hey, we had this amendment to the US Constitution and now all women can vote. There was a back and forth. There were several states and territories prior to becoming states that gave women the right to vote in their state. Some granted it and took it back and then added it in again. It was a constant back and forth. There was a conversation happening where laws were passed and people were angry about the laws, and there was always debate going on politically about whether women should have the right to vote. It wasn't just a flashpoint where overnight this happened. So, we learned about that. We studied those movements and we say, how do we apply that to rights of nature? Because we understand that this is very bold. This is very different. A lot of people, even who are sympathetic to it, need to take some time to think it through and say, is this something I really agree with, or how would this actually work? But when you do that, you see that we need to, this is really vital because I think, like most of us, we're looking around and seeing that we are not winning for the most part. The environment generally has gotten worse in more recent decades. I think it depends on when you start, because I'll put this asterisk there. If you're a little bit older and you were growing up in the 60s and 70s and you were there when the EPA was established and when the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and some of these major landmark pieces of legislation occurred, you're probably remembering and kind of like still living in that mindset of when this stuff came out and it was really kicking ass, pardon my French. But those laws really did turn around a lot of great things. But if you weren't paying really close attention, you might have missed that, especially in the 80s and 90s, several amendments were made to the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. Several political strategies were made, like regulatory capture being very deliberately put in place for a lot of the state regulatory agencies. We started to see some of the flaws, the flip side of that, that there were ways to kind of kneecap these regulatory bodies and these regulatory models and these major laws in such a way that it started to say, is maybe do we need to do more? And I will say that there was always a divide between the younger folks who were more in their 20s and 30s on this campaign and the folks who were more in their 50s, 60s, 70s, because we had a lot of hesitance from more of our older and experienced activists in the realm of this that said, oh, we just need to do a better job of lobbying and all this will go away. And if only you guys could help us write more letters or, get more people to show up to the hearing. That's all we really need to do is just get more bodies to the hearing, get more letters, get more letters to the editor published. And we have the Clean Water Act. We just need to use it. And the younger people, and myself included, were looking around and saying, in our lifetimes, we haven't seen any of that stuff work. We've seen letter writing campaigns that were tremendous and got thousands and thousands of letters sent to politicians, and the politicians still didn't do the right thing. We've been to hearings, we've packed hearings. We've seen hearings on an issue where 150 people showed up to say, don't do this thing, EPA, and one or two people representing agencies showed up to say, please do this thing, EPA, and the EPA sided with the one or two people. And it shows you that a hearing is just a hearing. They're just hearing. They have no commitment to actually listen or do anything. But they'll give you, they'll say, we listen and we really appreciate your comments. And for some people, that's enough. I guess, the feel good of I got heard by government bureaucrat. And as long as they heard us out, I guess it's okay that they're still destroying the land that we depend on to live. There's this there's this tension, right? And so it was tough, and it was a long time before we could really come together and say, it's not that it's an either or. Obviously, we want to do whatever we can, and if there's a way to help with the lobbying, we'll do that. But we do consistently find that there are serious challenges to that, and that maybe it's worth the time, even though it's such a big lift and such a long haul to think about rights of nature getting to become a reality in the United States. We've all been kind of trained by CELDF to look at this as an approach that says, this takes decades of work. It really does. It takes decades of fighting and asserting and saying this has to happen. And one of the ways you do that is you do these local initiatives and then see where the courts go. Because if you look at the history of abolitionists, there were cities and there were states that were fighting slavery and they were passing laws that were getting overturned by courts, but they still passed the laws anyway. And when the court would overturn the law, they just turn around and pass it again or pass it slightly differently. That back and forth, that contention is kind of necessary. And you have to be going into this understanding you're going to get a lot of losses before you get a big win. But the one thing we do know is that if we keep asserting that we want to see rights of nature, and we assert that and we prove that by letting the public vote on it, by making this an issue that they can't say, well, that's just a handful of cranks. Well, 61 point so many percent of people in Toledo, Ohio, despite a major publicity campaign against it, still enacted this. That's got to mean something. And if our political system means anything, it has to mean that people's opinions matter and count. So to win these difficult legal victories, we have to have some political victories. Before the courts are going to actually say, you know what, these rights of nature people have a point, and all those references to the case laws and the decisions and the dissenting opinions, yeah, that actually has merit. Before that happens, and before we have judges that are going to do that, there has to be political victories. There has to be things that are pushing the issue, forcing the issue, getting people to talk about it, and getting people going, you know what, I think that actually is a good idea. So, Vox, did a, video piece that went viral on social media talking about the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. And if you look at the comments section, people were like, wow, this actually makes a lot of sense. And I think we were on the Daily Show. We were interviewed about it, Trevor Noah, the response from people watching the clip and people in the audience and from Trevor, it's like, yeah, this makes sense. This is interesting. I think I could get behind rights of nature, right? The idea actually has a lot of appeal and it kind of makes sense to a lot of people. The devil's in the details, but don't get discouraged just because, yeah, it's a tough fight politically or the courts are going to resist it and they're captured. I mean, it's regulatory capture over here and judiciary capture over here. We've got to fight on every front to get this environment protected the way we know it needs to happen. So I have a quote from Frederick Douglass that I think always bears repeating, one of the great abolitionists and a former slave. But I'm going to just state, even though you can all read it there, but it's so powerful, I think it needs to be read. Let me give you a word of the philosophy of reforms. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate or deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its mighty waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And what we see ourselves doing here in the rights of nature movement is creating the demand, asserting the demand. We need rights of nature. We need a stronger form of recognition for nature in our legal system so that we can finally get it treated with the proper respect for enforcement of laws and its protection than we're getting right now. So it's an interesting idea. I welcome debate and I welcome questions. I'm sorry if this went a little long. If you want to get in touch with me after this, that's my personal email address. I'm also going to put links to CELDF, CELDF.org, if you want to check out their stuff and kind of see what they've got going on. Thomas Lindsay, and part of why there's been conflict between CELDF. Thomas Lindsay had a big fight with them. He started another group called Center for Environmental Rights, or CEDAR, Center for Democracy and Environmental Rights. So they have a group too. It's a little complicated. I'm nonpartisan. I'm not going forward against either of these orgs, but they have very similar stuff. And then Crow, which is working on doing a rights of nature matter here in Cincinnati. There's a link to their website so you can check out what they're doing. So with that, let me stop sharing my screen and we can just go into questions. So however we want to do this. Thank you.
All right, so Debbie and Phyllis are going to handle the questions from the chat.
And I am having trouble accessing the chat. It has disappeared from my screen.
Hover your cursor around the bottom and see what happens. Did it appear?
Mine had disappeared as well.
Not yet, but
you can also look for three little dots over at more. Go see if you can see three little dots.
Now I found it. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you. By the way, I'm going to interject a wonderful presentation, Sean. Thank you so much. Let's see here. So Gloria, where do you want me to start?
maybe
You
with-
had a question about the Morton Sierra Club versus Morton 1971 case?
Yeah, so I'm not deeply familiar with the details, and I've kind of scanned some of the questions, so I'm just gonna kind of salt it a little bit by saying I'm not a lawyer, and some of the nor am I a scientist. So some of these details I unfortunately do not have on hand. But I'll be happy to look that up. If you want to email me, I can dig that up and get some stuff sent back to you by email after this. So.
And Sarah Ryan asked, what was the toxin level that Toledo's water treatment measured?
I do not recall. Again, some of those details have been lost in the sands of time. One thing I can do, that I can tell you to add a little more context was, I do believe that the microcystin levels, they did find in hindsight that the city, they probably did not need to issue a do not drink advisory. That the levels probably weren't bad enough to really cause widespread, health issues. That said, microcystin and its impact are, especially at that time in 2014, there was still actually a lot of research that needed to happen yet about what the impacts were. So all we knew is it was bad. And I think there's been more studies showing the health impacts of it, particularly for liver. And we know animals, for example, that have drunk water with a lot of microcystin have died, like that's not good. So did they need to do the do not drink advisory? Probably not, actually, in hindsight. But what was the level and why did they trip that trigger? To be honest, I'm glad. I would rather they have done this than do what Flint did, for example, and just pretend the issue wasn't going on. And now people are getting Legionnaire's disease and such. I'm glad they erred on the side of caution. But it was a higher level than it should have been, for sure. We know that. And there was just a lot of uncertainty yet about what microcystin was. So and what its impacts were. So again, if you want to email me, I can try to dig that up and get some answers.
Thank you. Rosemary Heileman asked, indicated she would like to hear more about local media and how much it helped. There's a decline in the number of local newspapers these days, which is a great loss to activists who rely on them as allies.
I have to laugh a little bit at this question, only because this is actually what I've been working on for the last few years, is restarting a former alternative weekly called the Toledo Free Press. One of the last things the Toledo Free Press did in 2015 was cover the water crisis, and then it shut down. And I worked with the guy who ran that to bring it back as a digital nonprofit news outlet. So we've raised enough money. We just interviewed some people to be our editor-in-chief. We had some wonderful candidates. Local media, I'm really going to try to not go on a soapbox and a tangent, but I'll just suffice to say local media is incredibly important, and there's still a demand and an interest in it, yet it is declining. I would say social media has its limitations, absolutely, especially when it comes to fact checking, when it comes to depth and to more sober analysis. So we actually use social media a lot because we were small and scrappy and grassroots to help educate people and to bring people into the campaign. But we really, the local media was vital, including the television news, the Toledo Blade, the Toledo Free Press at the time. All these entities worked together to help make sure people knew and kept the issue alive. I give a lot of credit to the Toledo Blade in particular for really keeping the issue alive and constantly following up with articles. They went to all of the different, because when these things happen, University of Toledo started hosting these big conferences about this and having academics and people opine, and that's good. And those are opportunities for the Blade to cover it and explain in more layman's terms what was going on. Tom Henry, in specific, who's a longtime environmental journalist who's been at the Blade for over 30 years now, did an incredible job and deserves to be named. And he really covered that issue thoroughly. So yes, they were essential to keeping the issue alive and making sure that we had a base of people in the form of voters who would approve this. Yes, it's also declining and has declined significantly in the 10 years since. Yes, it's a serious issue that we should probably all be looking at. And yes, it's also something I am so motivated on that I'm actually bringing back a whole new news outlet specifically so that we always have something like this going on. So one of the many hats I wear these days is kind of local journalist, and I've been helping to get that going. So again, I could go on, and feel free to reach out to me by email if you want to talk more. But God, what a great question. And absolutely, media always plays a big role in any campaign, in my opinion. And if you're not engaging the media, either through the editorial page or the news section or both, you're really going to have a hard time getting your message out, period. Even if you're using social media and doing canvassing, media is so vital. So there you go.
Well,
I
and
was
they're responsible, social media, nobody's responsible for what's there, but
Yeah.
yeah.
I was just reading an article this morning and I was looking for it and I can't find it on a quick note, and I can't remember who sent it. Maybe Debbie did, but the state of Utah, the legislature just passed a law prohibiting rights of nature standing for any natural body. And I guess I think if I recall from the article, 3 states that have done that, or I'm sorry, I don't remember the details. I'll try to find it, but how alarming is that?
Yeah, well, we knew that. And actually, Ohio has done the same. I should have put that in the presentation. Ohio, very quickly after, and we found out that through some public records requests, it was the State Chamber of Commerce that actually basically made a phone call and got that slipped into like a budget bill, like nothing, and our state constitution has a single subject rule that's constantly, we can go on about this. Obviously, this was something that was likely then coordinated as model language to other states through ALEC or a similar organization, the American Legislative Exchange Committee. And so a lot of states are enacting it. It's alarming, yes, but part of me is not panicking, if only because that's the funny thing about laws. And, they get passed and then they can be overturned with another law. So it becomes a political question about shifting the balance of power in another direction, working with people who are interested in taking it in a better direction and helping to educate and inform them. And again, the only reason I have the confidence I do that this is not an insurmountable or a fight that can't be won is, again, the studies of the abolitionist movement, the suffragist movement. We always learn about these things in school from a very narrow, limited, and frankly reductive perspective that paints it like, hey, suddenly everybody noticed this thing and was bad, and within a couple years of some protests, it all turned around and it's been good ever since. And it's never as clean as that, right? That's just the 101 we all learn, and most of us never get the 102 or the 201 or the grad level experience. And the grad level experience always says, yeah, bad laws get passed. The Fugitive Slave Act is going to happen. You're going to see slavery doubled down on over and over again on the federal and state levels. But you're also going to see, if you pay attention and really do the history, there were constantly local and state pushback from people of conscience who said, no way are we allowing this. So it is alarming. We do need to know it. But especially as we look to things like gerrymandering reforms, which are really critical right now. And I wish there was a broader movement to counter things like the Federalist Society and some of these other heavily judiciary focused groups that have really dominated the courts. We really do need a counterbalance to that helps shift those in a different direction. None of that is impossible. Is it a big lift? You bet it is. But so is everything that's worth it. And that's one thing I would just assert is that when I hear that stuff, I get alarmed a little bit, but I don't let it dissuade me because I do understand that that's just part of the game. It's always going to be a figure. And as scary as it is, it's just a law. And, it's just a law. Any law that can be passed can be revoked. It can be amended. It can be changed. So we can't lose sight of that fact and can't let ourselves get too discouraged. So that's what I'll say about that.
Thank you. Mark, you had a question?
Yeah, I wanted to tell you all about when the Endangered Species Act was passed. I started working for them about a year before it passed. And what we told Congress, the environmentalists and our staff, is you got to sign this law because endangered species have the right.
Austin.
course, it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without some technical issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm reading the comment there, and I'm sorry if Mark comes back and I'm talking, but he's saying, yeah, the Endangered Species Act had it right there. The language was they have a right to exist. We have these nuggets of things that have already pointed us in the direction. Again, this goes back decades to does a tree have standing, and some of the dissenting opinions from Judge Douglas or Justice Douglas. And this isn't something that's wild and new and crazy and couldn't possibly happen and is just this brand new fad. It really does have a history and a valid legal basis, but the legal basis is always downstream from the political basis, which is why I focus on this has to become a political movement. Not so much a legal movement, although passing laws is a great way to do that and a very direct and a big thing to do. But starting movements to say this needs to be considered. For example, the National Lawyers Guild has adopted rights of nature in its organization's constitution. So that is something that they officially embrace. Certain state Democratic parties have embraced rights of nature and written that into their model, and there are activists who have worked on that level. And again, I see all of those as methods of moving the political issue forward, so that as we get the manifestation of grassroots groups passing laws and doing the lobbying and really moving this issue forward, we'll see that become not just a political movement, but a legal movement with teeth, not just something symbolic. And we never wanted to be just a symbolic victory. We knew that was part of it, but absolutely everybody involved wants to see rights of nature in our lifetime if we can, and we're going to do what we can to do it. So yeah, anyways, more questions or any other questions?
Is that it?
Super program. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you again for having me, and thank you to everybody who came to listen today. I'm just going to put my email address in the chat one more time in case you want to send me an email. And again, I think that can be passed around. So feel free to reach out if you want to just talk a little bit more. I have my hands full with several other matters, including restarting a local news outlet, but I'm always happy to, if nothing else, I can at least try to copy you or put you in touch with some people who might know a little more and give you some good answers to whatever it is you're looking about if I don't know. I see
Thanks,
Doris.
Sean.
Doris has.
Appreciate it.
I just wanted to say that Earth Justice is suing over the Great Salt Lake in Utah, which is drying up from climate warming. And they're going to use the Endangered Species Act to protect a bird who's losing its habitat there. And this kind of thing has also happened in Hawaii, that the Endangered Species Act, and I think this is what John is talking about, that there's other ways we can get to these successes. And I can see what's happening in Utah with the bad guys trying to make it illegal to protect nature. We also need to publicize who those people are, because it's so evil. And but the use of the Endangered Species Act is another tool. So I'm glad, and I thank Sean very much for giving us this great history of the struggle, because that's what it is. You really pointed out that we shouldn't be discouraged, because there are little victories along the way. So thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Doris. And you reminded me, possibly because you mentioned the state of Utah, but there's the famous quote from Utah Phillips, the folk singer. The earth isn't dying, she's being killed. And the people killing it have names and addresses. So, take that how you will. But I always love that. And it just is a reminder to stay grounded in the reality that there's active harm being done to the very systems that we absolutely depend on for life. There's people with very short-sighted views making this world uninhabitable, not just for us, but for other living things. And we really do have a calling to go out there and protect that, not only just because it's the right thing or the moral thing to do, but because we absolutely need to do it for ourselves. And I know many of you here on this call feel that and understand that. And again, I just want to end by saying thank you again for taking the time today. and for being soldiers in your own way in the movement to make this world a habitable and a better place to live for everybody and for all things, including nature. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good
Yeah.
night, everybody.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Good night.